Oh, hi kids. I was just talking to Baby Doll about the new year. The new year is 2021. Have you seen a new calendar yet? It was time to put away the old calendar 2020 and to bring out the new calendar for 2021. Just as every month, it's time to change from one month to the next month. The old month is over and the new month begins. That's the way it is. The old ends, the new begins. Today, we are looking back at all that we've learned in the Old Testament, the first half of the Bible, because next week we're going to start the New Testament. Now, the Old Testament tells us the story of how God began everything and how he set up a plan of salvation to make us his forever. The New Testament is how God brought that salvation to us when he sent his son Jesus to the earth. So I'd like you to watch this review of the Old Testament and see how many of these stories do you remember.
We saw how God created everything in the universe with his words, and it was very good. He made a man in his own image and then made a woman from the man. But the two people disobeyed God, and this was the beginning of sin among humans. The world changed. It was under a curse. Nothing would go as well as it did before. Adam and Eve had many sons and daughters. The people became very angry, mean, and selfish. God was sorry that he had made them. But one man, Noah, and his family still followed God. He told Noah to build a huge boat called an ark. God was going to send a flood to cover the whole world and to make it new. Even the highest mountains would be covered with more than 20 feet of water, and beneath the water, God was reshaping the land. Noah, his family, and the animals were starting all over when they came out of the ark. God wanted the people to spread out over the whole earth, but they refused. Instead, they built a tower to show how great they were when they worked together. So God gave them different languages and different ways of doing things. Now they spread out to different parts of the world and started many different nations. God chose one man, Abram, to be the father of a nation that he would bless in a special way. Through this man and his family, all the people of the world would be blessed. Many years later, God would send his own son Jesus to be born into this family. Jesus would take away all the sin of the world and would undo the curses that came with it. God promised Abraham a homeland in Canaan. It would belong to these special people until the end of time. Abraham's son, with his wife Sarah, was named Isaac. When he grew up, he married Rebekah, and they had twin sons, Jacob and Esau. Jacob's name was changed to Israel, and later, the land his people would live in was also called Israel. Joseph was the 11th of his 12 sons, and God made him a ruler in Egypt. This led to God's people moving to Egypt to escape a famine, a time when there was not enough food in Israel. The Jews lived in Egypt for 400 years and became a large number of people, but the Egyptians made them their slaves. Moses was born during this time and grew up in Pharaoh's palace. When he was 80 years old, God called Moses to lead his people to freedom. When Pharaoh refused to let the Jews go, God sent 10 plagues on the Egyptians, but spared his own people. Finally, all 2 million Jews left Egypt, and God kept them safe through the Red Sea as they went through the waters to freedom. They lived in the wilderness for 40 years and learned God's special rules for their special nation, as well as his rules for all people. And when Moses died, Joshua led the Israelites into Canaan. Then God appointed judges to rule the Israelites for 250 years, judges like Samson, Gideon, and Deborah. Ruth lived during the time of the judges. Samuel was the last judge and the first prophet of Israel. God called Samuel to anoint the first 2 kings of Israel, Saul and David. King David wrote many beautiful psalms or songs that we still sing and read in worship. His son Solomon built the first temple for the Lord in Jerusalem. But King Solomon and the Jews disobeyed God, and so the kingdom was split into two kingdoms when he died, Israel and Judah. Around this time, God called Jonah to prophesy against an enemy city, Nineveh. But Jonah tried to run away and was swallowed by a large fish. Later he preached in Nineveh, and the people turned away from their sins. Many other prophets were sent by God to tell his own people to come back to him. They warned them that if they did not turn away from sin, their land would be destroyed, and they would be taken out of Israel. God also promised to send a Savior who would be a suffering servant. About 600 years before Jesus came, an 8-year-old boy named Josiah became the king. He got rid of all the idols the people had been worshiping. He read God's law, and the people turned back to the Lord. But when the people turned away from God again, he sent other prophets to call them back. They did not listen, and so they were captured by the Babylonians who destroyed Jerusalem. They were forced to live in Babylon. God sent Ezekiel to show the Jews that their nation would come to life again, like a valley of dry bones in the desert. Meanwhile, Daniel told King Belshazzar God's message that the Medes and Persians would take over his empire. The new king, Cyrus, let some of the Jews go back to Jerusalem. They rebuilt the temple, and Ezra became their priest. Queen Esther saved the Jews from an evil plan. The prophet Malachi wrote the last book of the Old Testament. Then 400 years passed from Malachi's time until John the Baptist came. The temple was in a state of disrepair. The Persians were conquered by the Greeks, who were then conquered by the Romans. The Jews lived under all of these empires. King Herod, working for the Romans, rebuilt the temple a third time. It was bigger and more beautiful than ever. Now the time was right for God's special Son, Jesus, to be born. He could offer the sacrifice for sin in Jerusalem, and his message of salvation could travel fast on the many roads that the Romans had built all over the empire.
Boy, that was a lot to remember. Do you realize that we went through 4,000 years of history in 6.5 minutes? I wonder how much of that you remembered. Well, I'm looking forward to next week, starting to talk about God's wonderful plan of salvation in Jesus. Until then, have a wonderful week.